All right. Welcome back to the Gemarah Shir. We had a little break last week while I was up in the north, which was very beautiful, to be recommended to anybody who wants a quick break. Go up to the north, spend some money in Israeli hotels, and it was very good. Okay, so we are in the Gemarah of Sanhedrin, and the recordings of these shurim are very useful, even if only to me, so that I can listen to the last 10 minutes, so I can see where we got up to last time. So it might be worthwhile doing that for the regulars to actually just have a look and see where we got up to last week, or 2 weeks ago, as it turns out, because we sort of left it in a little bit in the middle last time. What we were talking about, of course, is whether a judge who initiates compromise is to be praised or to be damned. And of course, like everything else in our wonderful religion, it depends on who you go by. Rabbi Meir says that to do a compromise is a terrible thing, and a compromiser is considered to be a blasphemer. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha over here, I need to share the screen with you. Let me just share the screen. Okay. Yeah, can you see the screen? Yeah. So over here, Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, he says it's a mitzvah to do a compromise. So there we have two ends of the spectrum. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha brought a proof for his position, and this is what we spoke about last time. He brought a proof from a verse in Shmuel Bet, and the verse is over here for us. Vayehi David oseh mishpat utzdaka. King David executed mishpat utzdaka, justice and tzedakah. I'm not going to translate tzedakah. We had a little discussion last week at the end about what tzedakah was, all sorts of different explanations of how the word tzedakah means all sorts of different things depending on context. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha's position was this, that a mishpat, he says, v'halo kol makom, every place sheyesh mishpat. If you've got a place where you've got justice, ain't tzedakah, then that's not tzedakah. That's not what we would call charity. It's justice. Tzedakah ain't mishpat. And if you're giving charity, that's not justice. That's something tzedakah. The implication is that's something over and above that which a person deserves, if you like. So what does it mean? Oh, then he says, Ela ezu mishpat sheyesh bo tzedakah. What kind of judgment is there in which there is tzedakah? Have omer, you have to say, ze bitzua. This is compromise. So that was Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha's position, that it's a mitzvah to do a compromise if you're a judge, and he brings this proof. And what we said at the end of last week's shiur is that, remember, Rabbi Meir at the top of the page here where my pointer is, he's the one that says it's a terrible thing to do compromise, and he brought himself a proof from the story of Judah and Joseph. Remember, we went through that we used that same expression, ma betza ki na roget achinu. What good will come of it? And it's a bad thing. So as we explained at the end of last time, if you have two people arguing about a point in Gemarah, and Rabbi A, in this case Rabbi Meir, brings a pasuk to support his position, and Rabbi B, in this point, Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, brings a different verse to support his position, there are two things we can do. We can, and this the first thing we do is that you allow each of the sides to try and rubbish the other side's argument. Okay, so Rabbi Meir brought Pasuk A, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha brought Pasuk B. Now, Rabbi Meir is going to go to Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha and say, nah, your explanation of your verse is wrong. I've got a different explanation of your verse. And this is how Rabbi Meir, who, remember, is anti-compromise, this is how he understands the verse of Shmuel Bet, which says King David did tzedakah and mishpat u'tzedakah. So remember, Rabbi Meir said, if you've got tzedakah and mishpat together, the only thing that can be is a compromise. And Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Meir is now going to come along and say, no, that's not the case. So this is where we are now beginning new material. Up till what I've just said, up till now, is where we left off last time. Atan l'Tana Kama. The Tana Kama, Tana, you know what a Tana is. A Tana is a rabbi from the Mishnah. Kama means the first. So Tana Kama was the first person we talked about in this whole subject, which was Rabbi Meir. So what does he say? He says, Dan et hadin, zika et hazakai v'chiyev et hachayav. So this is what he says that pasuk refers to. The way that King David did his judging was like this. Dan et hadin. He gave a straightforward, clear, halachic judgment. No compromise. Zika et hazakai. The one who was correct, he said was correct. V'chiyev et hachayav, and the one who was obliged to pay up, he made him pay up. He said, no, you have to pay. That is the straight halacha. That is what King David did. However, v'ra'ah, he would see, in a certain case, shenitchayev ani mamon, that the guy who had to pay up, the guy who lost the case, was an ani, with an ayin, a poor person. So what did he do? V'shilem lo mitoch beito. King David would pay the guy's debts out of his own pocket. So Rabbi Meir says, Zeh mishpat u'tzedakah. Zeh mishpat. The judgment was a straightforward, clear judgment. There was no compromise. Yankel owes Chaim 100 shekels. That's the psak din. Yankel owes Chaim 100 shekels. Trouble is, Yankel has got no money. So after the case had all finished, King David would take 100 shekels out of his pocket and give it to Yankel so that Yankel could pay Chaim. And that, says Rabbi Meir, is mishpat u'tzedakah, and that is what this verse, Vayehi David oseh mishpat u'tzedakah, that is what it refers to. So Rabbi Meir is consistent with his view, and he says to Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, you have brought me a proof that compromise is a good thing, and you've brought me this verse of how King David did compromise. I don't think you're right. What King David did was not compromise at all. He did mishpat, he gave a straight halacha, and then he did tzedakah afterwards. If the guy couldn't afford it, he would pay up for him. Now, you may think that that's an unusual way of behaving. And I even saw Howard give a little shake of his head and cover his eyes as if to say, oh, goodness me, that's not how the courts should run. But you know, it's not an uncommon thing. I'll tell you a little story. Hamevin Yovin, who the person, there's one person here who will know exactly about whom I'm talking. There is a chap in Manchester who is a very, very harsh businessman. Some would say a crooked businessman, but let's say that he's harsh. Let's use that example. And you can do business with this fellow at your peril, and he will be very harsh and drive an extremely hard bargain. You can go to this fellow the next day and ask for tzedakah, and he will give you very, very generously. Because for him, mishpat and tzedakah are completely two different things. This is not an uncommon scenario. And I always thought that this was a bit strange, really. I thought that I liked to think that, you know, you would roll everything into one. If I've got a dispute with somebody over £100, right, and I know that this guy hasn't got it, and I'm happy to give it to him as tzedakah anyway, why don't I just write off the £100 that he owes me? And that's it. I'll just say to him, forget it. Forget the debt. It's okay. No, they don't do that. They go and say, no, you owe me £100. I want my £100. You want tzedakah? Fine. Come to me when it's time for giving out tzedakah. I'll give you £100 with a great sense of pleasure. And I think it's I always thought that it was a bit of an odd personality that did that, to be honest, until I prepared for this shiur. And I realized that there is a source for this behavior. And the source for this behavior is Rabbi Meir's interpretation of a pasuk in Shmuel Bet. Now, for these kind of people for whom the scriptures are absolutely everything, if they have an opportunity to fulfill, even if it's only not a mitzvah, but to actually do something which is talked about in scripture, they will do it, however strange it might seem to us. And I only realized when I was preparing for this shiur, and I thought about this particular fellow, that that's why he does it. Because Rabbi Meir is a Tana with great credentials, and he interprets this pasuk as exactly that. Mishpat is mishpat, and tzedakah is tzedakah. Okay, so we carry on. Mishpat lezeh. So that scenario is you have justice for this one. You're the judge. You're David HaMelech in this case. The guy that's won the case because he deserves to win the case because the facts speak for themselves and he gets his money back. That's mishpat. Tzedakah lezeh. And the other one has received tzedakah because David HaMelech has put his hand in his pocket and given the poor person the money with which to pay his debt. And then the Gemara spells it out for us a bit more. Mishpat lazeh she'echzir lo mamon. The guy that won the case, that's justice because he gets his money back. Tzedakah lazeh, and it's charity for the other one. Sheshilem lo mitoch beto. He, i.e. David HaMelech, paid out of mitoch beto, out of his household. In other words, out of his money. Okay, and then we say, we quote a strange thing. The Gemara seems to repeat itself. Now, you know by now that the Gemara, generally speaking, speaks in very clipped tones. It doesn't labor the point. Often it only tells you half a pasuk and you have to guess the rest of it. And here it goes out of its way to actually repeat the pasuk. It's a bit odd. V'chein b'David. And similarly, with regard to David, who Omer, the pasuk says, Vayihi David oseh mishpat u'tzedakah l'chol amo. He does justice and tzedakah to all his people. Mishpat lezeh shehechzir lo et mamono. It's repeated word for word, that same pasuk. Why? Why has the Gemara done something very different to its normal procedure and repeated something? Can you spot a difference here? Can anybody spot a difference? Larry and Sharon, I don't know which one of you it is because I can't see you. There we go.
Yes, I'm not looking at the difference because I was just trying to raise my hand. But my question is this: do you believe, Johnny and other classmates, that this would actually have been the way King David would have run his country, given what we know and don't know about his life and the level of sort of behaviors at those times? Or are we talking about David as the founder of the time of Mashiach, and that this is really an example of what times will be like when Mashiach comes and justice and charity are united?
Okay, let me answer that question. I'm quoting to you, I don't know if can you see my screen? I've changed the screen now, it's not the Gemara. This is now Shmuel Bet, chapter 8. And if we have a look at our verse, I can't remember what it was. It might be verse 15, I think. Here we go. Vayimloch David al Kol Yisrael. And David reigned over all Israel. Vayehi David oseh mishpat u'tzedakah lechol amo. So if you take this verse at face value, it is actually speaking about historical facts. And if you go further up into the chapter, you can see that Shmuel is telling us a piece of history. Very briefly, it came to pass, David smote the Plishtim, he then smote Moab, and then the next lot, and then he expanded the country, he took lots of money, etc., etc., and then he became the king of all Israel. And this is how he reigned over all Israel, and he administered justice and charity for all his people. So on the face of the verse that the Gemara is quoting, Sharon, it seems very clear that it is talking about actual historical facts. Can we extrapolate into the future from this? Why not? Why not? It's always a good thing to take positive things out of history and try and repeat them, and to see the negative things in history and to try and avoid making the same mistakes. So the simple answer to your question to me is, do I think that this is what happened? Yes, this is what it says in Shmuel, and I believe that that is how David did execute his justice in the land of Israel at that time. Anybody else want to say anything on that point? If not, I repeat my question. Why is the Gemara? Let me go back to the Gemara.
Hi, I wanted to say something. At the time, surely David was not the only judge in Israel. Surely there were, it was a large area. Surely there were numerous judges. And is it just, are they saying that that was his direction to all of them, that they all distributed justice and charity simultaneously? Or was that what he did in his special court?
That's a very good question. I suspect that that is what he did in his court because he was King David. And I don't think that it would have been expected of other judges necessarily to do that. I think that Howard's reaction, which was one of horror to this whole idea of a judge dispensing charity at the same time as justice, I think that's probably what most people would have done. I'm a judge and that's it. And if we get through to it later on, a little bit later on in this Gemara, we will see, I'm hoping we might even touch on it today, we will see actually that the judges were not necessarily dispensing charity with their justice, as you will see in a little while. So I think that this was probably a peculiarity of King David's court, that he was in a particular position where he could do that. I don't think that was a directive from the High Court to all the lower courts. That's my view. I have no evidence for that, but that's what I think. Yes, Howard.
How did? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Howard first, and then Nachum.
Okay.
My assumed horror comes only from the fact that this seems to be an aberration. Everything else is so logical and sensible and seems to have filtered down into legal practice today. And then you get this aberration that undermines the whole administration of justice. It doesn't matter if you lose. Don't worry about it. The judge will pay. It's just
yeah. The way you put it there is very odd. I agree. Remember that this is Rebbe Meir trying to get himself out of a hole. You have to remember that. This is not the sort of bottom line yet. We haven't come along and said, yes, Rebbe Meir's interpretation of this pasuk is right. Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha's explanation of the pasuk is that that King David encouraged compromise. A much more satisfactory explanation of the pasuk, I'm sure you would agree. Rabbi Meir is in a hole because he's got to find a way of saying that Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha is not right in that interpretation. This is just his view of it. And remember, Rabbi Meir is the one who is very anti-compromise and therefore has to find some kind of situation which avoids compromise. Yes, Nachum.
Well, one question is, how do you get to King David? I like him.
How'd you get to his court?
Yeah. I mean, how do I get picked to go there? That's one question. I mean, and number two is, this is a great boon to poor people. I go out, I get myself in debt to certain people, I collect money, I hide it somewhere, I tell the judge I'm poor, and the judge says, okay, don't worry. I mean, this is chaos. You can't have a government like that. You can't have a society like that. This is nonsense. So I don't know if we should interpret David's charity that in the same way as we're reading it. I can't believe that a man of such ability would behave this way completely, and that all the other judges are doing what's right and poor people are running around getting in debt about things. This is no society.
Okay, let me try and be, I hesitate to use the expression devil's advocate with King David, but let me try and defend his position. What if it was not quite the way Rabbi Meir has said it, or not quite the way I have interpreted, or the Gemarah has interpreted what Rabbi Meir is saying? Let's say it was like this. King David did mishpat. You went for your court case, and you were found against you. You had to give 100 shekels to Chaim. You then go and the court officers would then go to you and say, right, where's your money? And you say, I haven't got any, I'm poor. I haven't got 100 shekels. So they would say, well, if you haven't got 100 shekels, then what are we going to do? Because Chaim needs his money. So what would happen in the secular courts today, I believe, is that the courts would say, okay, well, you owe 100 shekels. You must have, you must have something that you live on. You can't live on fresh air. I don't know, maybe you haven't got 100 shekels spare, but I'm going to put a thingamajig on that says you have to pay a shekel a week for 100 weeks. Right? That's something that happens in courts, isn't it? You have a fine. If you can't pay it, then you come to some arrangement about how you will eventually pay off this fine. Okay? So what would he do, the guy? He would then go and say, okay, well, I've got to find this money now. So he would then go to the local gemach, and he would say, I need 100 shekels. Why do you need 100 shekels? Because I have a fine to pay, I have to pay so-and-so. Now, if you have a complete separation of the justice arm of King David's court and the tzedakah arm of King David's court, it doesn't sound so bad, because he can then apply to King David's tzedakah arm, which King David is not personally himself administering, because he has some Gabbai tzedakah to do it for him. And therefore, the justice is not compromised. Now, I'm not suggesting that that necessarily was the way it was, but it doesn't sound as bad like that as it did the way we said it before. So you're going to say to me, in your good Gemarah cop, but that's not what it says. It says, V'shilem lo mitoch beito. He paid him from his own house. Well, technically it was his, because it was his tzedakah, but he'd handed it over to some administrators of his fund. So I agree with both Howard and Nachul that on the face of it, this is not a society that is stable. But I think that without too much alterations, I think you could have a situation where you could have Rebbe Meir's interpretation of tzedakah u'mishpat, which would actually work. So that's my attempt at defending Rabbi Meir's view. Yes, Marcel?
What's the difference between that and public assistance? In England, if you can't afford a lawyer, the court pays for it.
Yeah, you can see that there is a similarity there, because similarly, there are two different departments. You've got the Justice Department, and then you've got the social, the social services, or the legal aid department, or whatever you want to call it. And that's really what you're saying, Marcel, is really backing up what I'm saying, is that if you make a distinction, at the end of the day, everything belongs to King David because he's the king. But if you make a distinction between the two departments, then it's not quite as bad as it seemed at first glance. Okay, let's go back to my question now, please. Why is the Gemarah repeating itself? And any Hawkeyes here who can tell me the difference between these two versions? Let's go back to the here. This is the pasuk here that we quote. David says, "Vayhi David oseh mishpat u'tzedakah." That was the first time the pasuk, the Gemarah tells about it, and then it goes and says exactly the same thing all over again, over here in this section where my pointer is now. So, who's the Hawkeye here that spotted the difference? Howard, have you spotted the difference?
I'm not sure that I have, but I would have said, because it is an aberration, they don't want you to think you've misunderstood it, so they repeat it.
Yes, they do repeat it, and I think they repeat it for emphasis. But there is.
But it says similarly with regard to David.
And then it quotes the same pasuk.
And David executed justice and charity to all his people.
Okay. Shall I put you out of your misery, folk?
There's bold in the English on the words to all his, but not on the second version. Very
good. Julia's the Hawkeye. Let's have a look at the first version of it. V'chein b'David hu omer. And similarly with David it says, Vayhi David oseh mishpat u'tzedakah. And it stops before the end of the pasuk. Rav Steinsaltz very kindly, in his non-bold, adds in to all his people. Why does he do that? Because the pasuk itself, where's our pasuk?
15.
Thank you. Here, the pasuk says, "Vayidav oseh mishpat u'tzedakah l'chol amo." So the first version of our Gemarah stops at u'tzedakah and doesn't say l'chol amo, to all his people. Rav Steinsaltz helps us out by adding it in. Over here, in the second time, the Gemarah quotes the entire pasuk. So the difference between those two versions are those two words here, L'chol Amo. And as Hawkeye Posner over there spotted, to all his people is in bold here because it's actually translating the actual words of the Gemara. Whereas the previously, Rav Steinsaltz had added it in to help us out. So there's a reason why they did that. Howard, you're also right. The fact is that it's odd and that therefore it wants us to take notice of this. The Gemara does not repeat itself just willy-nilly. As we said before, it usually only gives us half a story, never mind a double story. Yes, Howard, you want to jump in, I can see.
Well, not really. I shouldn't really, because what I wanted to say is what I said last week. You can translate staka as meaning righteousness, and they really go together, like salt and sodium bicarbonate rather than salt and pepper.
Okay, but that's not our point here on the Chol Amo.
No, I accept that.
Okay, so the difference here in these two versions is the Chol Amo. David, are you wanting to say something?
Just in the art scroll and the big boys Gemara, as you would say, it's in brackets, and there's a note to say that some of the Mefarshim don't have this line in their printed editions. So it could also be a scribal error.
Okay, I don't think it is, because I don't think it is a scribal error, and I think it's there deliberately. And I am going to show you why I think that. And the answer is in the next piece of Gemara. Let's look at the next piece of Gemara. Kasha le Rebbe. Kasha, everybody's heard of that, haven't you? Right? On Seder night, what do? We ask the four kashas. What's a kasha? Kasha is a question. It's a difficulty from the Hebrew word kasher, meaning hard or difficult. Kasha le Rebbe. Rebbe, who's Rebbe? Rebbe is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, we know that. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi has got a difficulty with this. It's a kasha, it's got difficulty. Hai l'chol amo. What do you mean to all his people? La'aniyim mi ba'ilei. If Rabbi Meir, you are going to interpret the pasuk in the way that you have, that King David dispensed justice and tzedakah by giving money to the poor person who can't afford to pay his debt, then what you're talking about, the verse is not accurate, because the verse says, L'chol amo, to all his people. Not everybody is poor. He didn't do that for every litigant. He only did it for the poor people. And I can see Nachum's loving it, because Nachum is thinking, why didn't I think of that? That's so obvious, right? And the reason that Nachum, that you didn't think of it, because intelligent though you are not Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi thought of this straight away. And he says, Hi, l'chol amo, and he hit me by. So that doesn't, now Rabbi Meir's in a corner, isn't he? Because not only has Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha interpreted this verse to mean compromise is a good thing, which is the opposite of what Rabbi Meir holds. But now somebody, and not just any old person, Rebbe himself, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, has come along to Rabbi Meir and said, your interpretation of the verse is not correct, because it doesn't make sense, because it says, L'chol amo, to all his people. And that is inaccurate. And Shmuel Hanavi would not have written something which was inaccurate.
Can I just say something? Sorry. In the translation of where we had the numbers 1, 2 from Shmuel Bet, it actually didn't use the word to all his people. It used the word for all his people, I think. Yes.
Oh, it did, yes. Okay.
Well, I'm just wondering, that has a different meaning, really. I know in Ivrit, the lamed could be 2 or 4, but I think 2 and 4 can have different meanings in English.
Okay, I think that's true, but I think that the point that Rebbe is making is that either way, whether it's justice and charity for the people or to the people, if Rebbe Meir's explanation of the pasuk is correct, it ought to refer to the staka, to the poor people. In other words, what Rebbe is saying, you have to understand what Rebbe is saying to Rebbe Meir. Rebbe is saying to Rebbe Meir, you have no evidence for your view. You've brought me evidence, but your evidence does not really support your view.
Mm-hmm. It's just, I think that if you use the word for, then it means something much more general, doesn't it? Which doesn't actually support Rabbi Meir's view in the first place, anyway.
No, I don't think either way it supports his view. And I think that's what Rebbe is pointing out.
Okay.
But that was very Hawkeye of you on that point as well, Julia. I think we're going to have to rely on you now in future for spotting anomalies. Okay, let's go back to our Gemarah. Where is our Gemarah?
Johnny.
There it is.
Yes,
Howard.
Can I just add that if you put staka into Google Translate, it gives you charity, justice, piety, fairness, merit, mercy, good deed, aims, justness, and bounty. But the point I want to make is that charity hits the frequency level with 3 dashes and all the others with 1 dash. And that's because in normal parlance, staka is used for charity. But in a specialized environment, such as a law court or the King's Court, it's much more natural to talk of justice and, judgment and justice. Judgment and justness, rather than just justice and charity. They just don't go together.
I will ask you this question, and I think that this really is the crux of it. First of all, we all agree that the word staka is difficult to translate into English, and context means everything. So what you're trying to tell me is that in a context of a court, staka doesn't mean charity. I will then ask you this question. What is the difference between mishpat and staka in this verse? You can't have 2 words meaning the same thing. What is the difference between mishpat and staka in your interpretation of this verse?
It's justice handed down in a proper manner, in a just manner, with justness, righteousness.
If this justice? Okay, so if this pasuk just said, Vayehi David oseh mishpat l'chol amo, are you going to jump up and down and say to me, wait a minute, it should say mishpat u'tzedakah? In other words, what I'm asking you is, according to your interpretation, I cannot see that anything is gained by adding in that word tzedakah. And that's not the way the way exegesis works. Exegesis works by saying you can't have a redundant word. And if you're telling me that mishpat and staka mean the same thing in this context, that's a redundant word.
They don't mean exactly the same thing. They mean a judgment which is delivered in a proper manner, in a just manner, with righteousness. Not just blind justice or arbitrary justice, proper justice, properly administered. But not with charity, as you said. That belongs in a different department, social security, legal aid, whatever it may be, or the charitable organisations. After the court, go outside and see them. But in my court, the judge might say, I'll give you a judgment with righteousness and justness.
I'm sorry, but I don't buy that at all. I don't see that the word staka adds anything to that word mishpat in your explanation. Mishpat is a judgment. That is the judgment. And why would the pasuk need to say the word staka to qualify mishpat? I just don't buy it, Howard. I think you're doing a Rebbe Meir here. I think you're in a corner. I think we have to say that the word staka has to add something more.
Well, I believe it does, but I'm not going to take up any more time.
Good. Okay, so we're agreed to differ. That's great. Always good to differ. Yes, Leon.
Mishpat is according to halacha, which is very different from righteousness. They
Okay,
don't have the same.
so
they don't
are you saying like me that staka actually is not the same as mishpat? So mishpat is your straight halacha. Staka is a kinder way of dealing with things.
Yes, I agree with you.
Which would fit in with
we've lost connection.
Lost internet engineer is here. Okay.
There's help. I'm being held hostage by Hezbollah.
Yes, Stanley.
Okay, I actually agree with Howard. Why I agree with Howard? Because at that time, justice could be perverted in a favor of somebody, depends on somebody's status, depends on somebody how much wealth he has, and all these things. Tzedakah, why, like every time you explain that tzedakah, it's not like monetary, exclusively monetary or tangible things. Tzedakah, it means to be righteousness, to do it correct. That what, it's not like he gonna give the money to somebody if somebody doesn't have money, but he do justice according exactly to the Torah without any preferences.
Okay, I agree with that, and of course I also agree with the idea that tzedakah can be mean lots of different things, and as we've said, it depends on the context. So I think it's great. We have a difference of opinion here. We could write a new version of the Gemara, couldn't we? We could actually write the Poleg commentary on Sanhedrin with Rabbi Howard says, right? And then Rabbi Leon disputes what Rabbi Howard says. I think that would be a great idea. It's a shame Philip isn't with us because he could write it all up for us. Anyway, let's carry on and see where we get to. So Rabbi says he's got a problem with this. He says that it should say la'aniyim. He doesn't like Rabbi Meir's interpretation. So what would you expect? You would expect Rebbe to say, I don't like Rabbi Meir's explanation. I prefer Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha's explanation, which is that this pasuk, tzedakah, mishpat u'tzedakah, means compromise, as we explained at the end of last time's shiur. But he doesn't. He brings a third interpretation. And the reason that he doesn't is that actually, and this is the greatness of Rebbe, actually Rebbe's view is on compromise is actually more in keeping with Rabbi Meir's view than it is with Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. So Rebbe, okay, let's put it this way. If I was Rebbe and I was supportive of Rabbi Meir's psak, and Rabbi Meir brought a proof for that psak, and I wasn't all that happy with it, but I supported his psak, I'd keep my mouth closed. I wouldn't criticize that interpretation, because actually he's using an interpretation to give a psak with which I agree. Rebbe, of course, is much more honest and perfect in his thought processes than I, and he cannot do that. He says, even though I support Rebbe Meir's position that I don't like the idea of judges making compromises, I can't sit here and allow Rebbe Meir to bring an explanation that doesn't fit. And it doesn't fit because of what we've said. It says l'chol amo, and it should say to the poor people. So I'll tell you, says Rebbe, what I think this pasuk means. And he says, Ella, Rather, this is what it's all about. Rebbe Meir says, "Afal pi shelo," he should say, "Afal pi shelo shilei mitoch beito." Even though he did not pay the money out of his own household, as Rebbe Meir wanted to suggest, Zeu mishpat utzdaka. It is still a case of justice, and let's translate. Let's use the word staka. Let's translate the word staka as kindness for the moment. Mishpat utzdaka. He's saying it's not that he paid out of his own pocket or his own household, because Rebbe agrees with Rebbe Howard, who says that that's not the way a system works. Oh, very popular I am today. I'm trying to turn these phones off as quickly as they ring. Sorry, everyone. So Rebbe says, I've lost my train of thought now. Yes, Rebbe says, no, that can't be right, that he's giving out money from his own household. But it's still mishpat utzdaka. It's still judgment, justice, and kindness. Why? It's mishpat lazeh utzdaka lazeh. Why? Mishpat lazeh shehechzir lo mamono. It's justice for the winner of the case because he gets his money back, right? Yankel has to pay Chaim the money. Utzdaka lazeh, and it's a kindness to the one that lost. Why? Shehotzi gezela mitachat yado. You're taking something which was not proper that he should have. Gezela is robbery. You've taken something which did not belong to him from out of his possession. He had in his possession 100 shekels that belonged to Chaim. He was holding stolen property, and that's a bad thing. So you're doing him a favor by taking the money off him. You're removing him from a position of doing an aveira, of doing a sin. Nobody wants. No, we have to remember that Yankel here is a fine, upright Jew. He happens to think he's right, that he doesn't owe this money, but he's wrong. He's not understood the halacha. He's not tried to steal this money, but he genuinely thinks that he doesn't owe this money. The judge comes along, David HaMelech in this case, and says, no, I'm sorry, but you do owe the money because the halacha is like this. At that point, when that halacha is made, it turns out that Yankel is holding Chaim's money illegally. It's not his. He shouldn't have it. So you're doing him a favor by making him pay. You're taking him out of the position of being a sinner, inverted commas, albeit an inadvertent sinner, to somebody who has done a mitzvah. What's he done a mitzvah? He's followed the judge's account. He's given the money back. He's no longer holding stolen goods. And that is something which is a tzedakah. I'll call it a kindness for want of a poor translation to the loser of the case. So Rebbe says, I don't like Rebbe Meir's explanation for the reasons that Howard and Nachum said, that society doesn't work that way. But what King David was doing by giving a correct judgment was actually turned out to be a positive thing for both sides. It was positive for the winner of the case because he got his money back. And it's positive for the loser of the case because he's no longer holding money or goods that didn't belong to him. And that is Rebbe's opinion of this pasuk. And we can learn from there that Rebbe does not support Rebbe Yeshua ben Korach, who says that compromise is a good thing, because had he done so, he would have gone back and said, I prefer the explanation of Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha that this pasuk refers to compromise. He doesn't use the pasuk to tell us that compromise is good, but he also doesn't use the pasuk in the way that Rabbi Meir does to suggest that justice and charity get all mixed up in the same department. Sharon.
Does that mean that the concept of one of the litigants, the one who loses or was guilty, was poor, is a fact that was thrown in from left field, as we Americans say, and that really is not an issue at all in the conversation, that was a mistake to have put in that, that hypothesis?
According to Rebbe, yes. According to Rebbe, that's exactly what Rebbe is saying. Rebbe is saying that this whole interpretation that Rebbe Meir has brought forward does not, as you Americans would say, get off first base. Yes. Any other comments, Howard?
There's a saying: "Hard cases make bad law." Which I thought was English practice, but in fact it comes from a case that Larry and Sharon will know better than I do, or a judge rather, Oliver Wendell Holmes, 1904. Hard cases make bad law.
And the principle of that is?
Well, if you've got an impecunious litigant, it's going to be a hard case to handle. And when the judge himself, not the king, pays out to benefit both parties, the plaintiff and the defendant, it's bad law. Hard cases make bad law.
It might be bad law, but it's jolly good sovereignty.
It's the wrong environment to dispense.
Okay, well,
it's interesting that the Gemarah is not thinking in English, but it's still thinking tzedakah as charity. It's really interesting. I agree.
Yes, Rabbi Meir's interpretation of tzedakah is charity.
Yes.
Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha is less so, but yes, you're right.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Okay, we've got just a few minutes. Let's just do one little bit more. I think we've got enough time to do Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh. Remember, we're in the middle of our mnemonic of eight different statements or comments regarding the subject of compromise. Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh. Okay, now then, who would like to guess which of our letters in our mnemonic Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh refers to? I'll just remind you of the mnemonic. The mnemonic is, hang on, the mnemonic is Sarmash ben Kash. So Samach Reish Mem Shin Bet Nun Kuf Shin. So Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh, who would like to guess which of those letters is Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh? No,
I'll go for the mem.
You'll go for the mem. Okay. Well, it obviously isn't the mem, Michael, because I wouldn't have asked the question if it was. you knew that anyway, but you were just playing the game with me. Obviously, it's not the mem because that would be far too obvious. So,
it's
anybody else?
Yud.
Yud. There isn't a yud in it in the mnemonic. Okay, it's. I'll tell you. It's the nun. It's the nun of Manasseh. Okay, it's. I think I've laboured this point enough now over the last few weeks that this mnemonic is absolutely hopeless. It would not enable anybody to remember anything because if you have to know the mnemonic, you might as well already know the people. So it's not going to help you at all. I don't think this is a very good mnemonic. But anyway, let's see what Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh has to say for himself. So he says a very interesting thing. Shnaim, two people, two litigants, Shaba'u lefanecha ladin, two litigants that come before a judge for a judgment. Ad shelo tishma divrehen, up to the point where you have not heard their evidence. Or misha tishma divrehen or you've heard the statements, but you have not yet in your mind any leaning towards either side of the argument. So two scenarios here. Either you've not heard the evidence yet, or you've heard the evidence, but you haven't any suggestion as to which way you're going to judge. Up till that point, says Reb Shimon ben Manasseh, Ata Rashai Lomar Lahen, you are permitted as a judge to say to them, Su'u ubitzua, go out and compromise. So you're allowed to encourage the litigants to compromise up to that point. However, Misha Tishma Divrehen, once you've heard the evidence, and you know which way the case is going, so you know that at this point, having heard the evidence, it's looking likely that Chaim is going to win the case against Yankel. At that point, you're not allowed to go and say to them, off you go and compromise. And he quotes a pasuk. Shenema, as it says in the pasuk, which is in Mishlei, and I'm going to show you that pasuk because I think it's important for you to see it. Here it is. Mishlei, chapter 17, verse 14. This is King Solomon. He says like this. The beginning of strife is like letting out water. And before you are exposed, abandon the quarrel. So what this pasuk is actually saying in its real context is that if you are thinking about having a row with somebody, think very carefully before you start. Because if you're going to abandon the quarrel, do it before you start. Because the beginning of strife, in other words, the beginning of a faribble, is like letting out water. What happens when you let out water? If I pour out my drink from this cup, you can't even see because of my background. There you are, you can see it now. If I pour this drink, what's going to happen? I can't control it anymore. It's going to go all over the place. Who knows where it's going to go? It's going to go onto my Gemarah. It's going to spoil my Gemarah. It's going to get into my phone, and it's going to spoil that. It could do all sorts of damage if I let this water out. So King Solomon, the wisest of all men, in this simple pasuk, which we would just perhaps pass us by, is giving us a very, very sound piece of advice. And that is that arguments and rows and quarrels are like letting out water. Once you start, there is no telling where it is going to go and what damage it can do. And therefore, before you are exposed, abandon the quarrel. By the way, I used a Yiddish word earlier on in this. I used the word faribble, which I can see Johnny's having a little smile about. That's a popular word where we come from, and Jeffrey's having a smile about it. Look where, by the way, do you know the origin of that word? It's in this pasuk. Look at this pasuk in Hebrew. Poter mayim reshit madon v'lifnei hitgalea hariv. Hariv. Riv means a quarrel or a disagreement. So a riv is a quarrel, and if you Yiddishize that word, you become faribbled. Okay, you become quarreled. Okay, so it's the same as if you are, you know the Hebrew word shmatter. If you are verschmattered, that means you are like a shmatter. You've become shmattered. Okay, so faribbled is somebody who is having a riv. So that's the origin of that Yiddish word there for you in this pasuk. I thought you'd like that. So what Mishlei is telling us, what King Solomon is telling us, is be careful. When you start rows, and you start arguments and you start court cases and you start disagreements, who knows where it's going to end up. This is like letting out water. You've no control over it anymore. And he gives you a piece of advice, and he says, before you get yourself into a bother, think about whether you really want to do this, and if possible, abandon the quarrel. Now, what's that got to do with us? What's that got to do with us? Let's go back to the Gemara. The first, Poter Mayim Rishit Madon Lefnei Gala Hariv Natosh, says Reb Shimon ben Manasseh, he interprets that pasuk like this. Kodem Shenit Gala Hariv. Before the Riv, before the case, Nitgala is revealed. In other words, before the verdict, before you know the evidence, before you know which way you're going to judge, Ata Yachol L'Notshom, you are able to abandon the judgment and say, go and compromise. However, Misha Nitgala Hariv, once the facts and the argument has all been out in the open, then you can't. Then nature has to take its course. Justice has to run its course. Once the case has been started, and you already know which way you're leaning towards the evidence, you can't stop the case as a judge and say, you know what, you two, I think you should go and compromise. And of course, that makes perfect sense, because if you think that the case is running towards Chaim, it would be unfair of you on Chaim to say, hang on a minute, everyone, I think you should go and have a compromise about this. It's not for you to say that once you know which way the thing is headed. However, if before you've heard the evidence, or you've heard the evidence and you still bang on a straight line, then it's appropriate for you to say, last chance, guys, before I consider this evidence. You want to go out and compromise? Now's your chance. And that is what Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh is saying. That is his little addition to our discussion regarding compromise, that a judge has permission to invite compromise up until the point where he has heard the evidence and he has begun to formulate an opinion. And that is where we will stop it for now. Any comments?
I have one. Yes, I've looked up Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh in my Who's Who in the Talmud, and I will take a scan of what it says about him so we can place him in the context of what his great rulings were. And you can send it out to all the participants with our blessing for a happy new year.
Thank you.
One of the things he was in the Jerusalem side of the dialogue between Babylonia and Jerusalem. And he had ordinary food and ritual purity, and did 1/3 prayer, 1/3 study, and 1/3 work. One of the things that they quote of his is that when, in response to the question, from where is it derived that the saving of life overrides Shabbos, he said, you shall keep the Shabbos, for it is holy unto you. It is given, and you are not given to the Shabbat. But elsewhere he says, when it says, and the children of Israel shall keep the Shabbat, that the Torah says, profane for his sake, that is for the one whose life you are saving, one Shabbat, so that he and you may keep many Shabbatot. So there is the context of this man.
Okay, thank you for that. I will send it out when I receive it. Thank you. Okay, any other comments before we wrap up? Okay, in that case, I shall wish you all, I'll stop recording, wish you all a Shana Tova. Let me stop recording first of all. And because I've got a few announcements, there we go, they don't need to hear our announcements.